Hey guys, Zach with Highsmith Guns. Here at Highsmith Guns in Greenfield, we are a Glock stocking dealer, so we do see a lot of the different generation Glocks that come through the door, and we've kind of amassed a cool collection of Gen 1 through 5 we thought it'd be kind of cool to do a video on. So, wanted to kind of go over the 17s. Late 70s, the Austrian Army was looking to adopt a new pistol to replace their older World War II era Walther P38s. Gaston Glock, kind of an entrepreneur, had his hands on a little bit of everything. Started out in the 60s making curtain rods of all things. In the 1970s, he had a military contract with the Austrian military for field knives, and he used a lot of polymers for the sheaths and the handles. He wanted to kind of take his turn into the pistol design. He had never done a firearm yet. In 1981, he applied for his patent for the Glock 17. This was for the P80 military pistol trials, and in 1982, the Austrian Army officially adopted the Glock 17 as the P80 pistol. 1986, the pistols would eventually make it to the U.S. market. Like I said, we've gotten a nice collection of Gen 1 through 5, and we'd like to do a little bit of a compare and contrast and kind of show you guys the ins and outs of them. Alright guys, so like I said, we've been able to acquire Gen 1 through Gen 5. The Gen 1 17 started hitting the US market about 1986. These is basically the same standard how the Austrian military adopted it as the P80. 17 round capacity, the tender finish on the slide. You have the standard grip texture. By 88, they were asking to have some requirements for the US market to kind of do a little updating. The grip was a little
loosey-goosey.
Little slick for the U.S. market liking. A lot of police departments that were starting to adopt these guys had some complaints with it, so they started to look to kind of do a little bit of updates to the gun. And that's where we were going. In 1988, you had the Gen 2 come through. And really the big things they've done externally from the Gen 2 to Gen 1 you'd see is the grips. They started adding a textured finish on the back and front of the strap. You still have that slicker kind of finish on the sides, but not as refined as it is on the Gen 1. You also started adding serrated cuts onto the trigger guard, kind of give you something a little bit more to grip onto from there. Still the same tender finish on the tops, 17 round capacity. Well, it's the same tried and true gun. Gen 2 Glocks would run from 1988 to about 1998, so about a 10-year run. The gun was really catching a lot of steam with police departments around the U.S. By the late 90s, it was starting to kind of fall back in the ways. Lights and accessory rails and stuff like that were starting to become more and more popular. They still weren't the most grippiest textured, and so Glock was looking to do a little bit more of an update. In 1998, we went to the Gen 3. And the big thing they started to add on to more with the textured finish, they still have the textured on the back and the front, but they've added finger grooves to fit a little bit more into the hand. You have an accessory rail. So that was a big thing. Like I said, in the late 90s, more and more police departments started to issue lights onto their firearms, aftermarket lasers, stuff like that. They also did beef up the frame, so you have a 2-pin system now. Originally, most of the other generation Glocks were a single pin. So with the beef up of the 2-pin system into the breech block of the gun, that allowed you to be able to do stronger calibers like 40, 45, 10 millimeter even. So they kind of beefed up the frame, and it kind of opened up a larger market into the guns. But other than that, internally, the 17s pretty much stayed about the same from Gen 2 to Gen 3. In 2008, the Generation 4 was released. So the Generation 4 was the first one to start revealing the extended magazine release to kind of help you breach onto the magazine release a lot more easier. They have changed the textured finish, so they kind of got away from the slicker side finish, give you a little bit more grip texture, something to grab onto. You still have the finger grooves they've retained from Gen 3. A nice little accessory they added onto was back straps. So if the gun didn't quite fit your hand quite right, you could pop out a pin. It would come with 2 or 3 different back straps. Slide that guy on, give you a little bit more of a beaver tail if you liked. You still have the accessory rail. Still is a 2-pin system. Glock would keep playing on with different finishes of the slide for durability. The Tennifer finish is probably one of the more popular ones, but they started playing around with a DLC coating, changing that up from there. But the Gen 4 would run from pretty much 2008 to 2016. They started experimenting a little bit more. Some changes need to be done to the gun they wanted to look at. The FBI and actually Indianapolis Police Department were the first to get the 17Ms, so it was an experimental upgrade they wanted to do. They had some requirements on it. They wanted to have ambidextrous controls, be able to switch over magazine release if needed. They didn't quite like the finger groups as much, so they started playing around with those. In 2016, the 17M would kind of evolve into what would become later the Generation 5, a year later. Generation 5. So this is the current generation. The 5th generation, they have gone to the DLC coating. It's a nice strong finish. Early Generation 5 did not have the front serrations. The later ones did. This is a later one. You still have the Glock accessory rail. They've retained the textured finish, but now they got rid of the finger groups. Something else they kind of found, they didn't really need the 2-pin trigger system, so they've gone back to a single pin system. Bigger caliber guns like the 22s and the Model 21s that are in 45 and 40, they beef up the slides. Beefy. But other than that, they pretty much kind of gave you the best of all the generations, where you have extended magazine release. You can switch over to each side. You have ambi slide releases. Front serrations if you want to press check your firearm. Got rid of the finger grooves. Either they fit you or they didn't. You do have a slight magazine bevel, so that makes for inserting magazines a lot easier. But more or less, that's the big jumps from Gen 1 to Gen 5. Like I said, these are the current generation of the Glock series. We're going to take these things apart, dissimilar. We're going to kind of show the ins and outs of Gen 1 through Gen 5 now. I have the Generation 1 already stripped down to kind of show you guys kind of an idea. This was the original P80 Glock frame, pretty much. Inside, for the most part, they pretty much all about stay the same. You have a great, striker system. You have internal safeties. The polymer frame, depending on the year, the plastics kind of changed over the years, get a little bit stronger. But really, like I said, we've gone over the details on the outside. The inside with the Gen 1 that kind of varies it a lot is they had a really thin profile barrel. And this would have started introducing what they used to call the polygonal rifling. That was popular in Europe. Not as much as you see over here in the States, but in Europe, it's a kind of a reverse rifling that helps with lifespan of it. You can put a lot of rounds through these Glocks. The springs are going to wear up for the rest of the gun, and springs are easy to replace. That's always something. It's not unheard of these Glocks going, 10, 15,000 rounds before they have to have, a whole rebuild of the springs. So if we can I don't know if we can see that polygonal rifling in there. You can see it's almost like a mirrored, it's hard to pick up the rifling. I almost call it ghost rifling too, but it's a really reliable system to keep the gun running a long period of time. It does not like lead casted bullets. That's always kind of the big thing. Glock's warning is don't run reloads for the gun, don't run lead nosed bullets. It will gunk up your rifling. Well, that was the big thing of the older generations. The skinnier barrels did heat up a little bit quicker. That's something they would amend on later generations. The recoil spring is non-captive, single pin, and that just your standard spring. In 1988, Glock began to get some feedbacks from police departments in the U.S. and military and police departments around the world that were using their guns. One thing they wanted to update on was beefing up the barrel. Much more thicker profile on the barrel than from the Gen 1s. That would add a lot more lifespan to the barrel. Wouldn't heat up as much. They've also created a captured recoil spring. So instead of having a single piece recoil spring, easy to lose your guide rod in it, everything's one piece. Keeps it very simple. Other than that, Gen 1 to Gen 2, those were really the big upgrades they did. Now, from Gen 2 to Gen 3, you still kept the same idea, captured recoil spring, single style recoil spring. The barrel is pretty much identical to how they did the Gen 2. A big upgrade they did is on the older generations, your extractor was very slab side. Gen 3, they added a little nub on here, so if you are loaded, that nub will stick out. That visually lets you know you've got one in the chamber, so they came up with a loaded chamber indicator. So that was a nice little update they did to it. All right, guys, and now we're on to, like I said, Gen 4 and Gen 5. So the Gen 4 barrels would continue on with the polygonal rifling. Same profile barrel, but the big update they did was you have a doubled up recoil spring now. So this was something they first introduced on the smaller Glock frames, the Glock 26 and 27s. This adds so much more lifespan to the firearm. So this allowed it to take a little bit more use and abuse where you don't have to change out springs as much. Nice captive system, very well done. Like we were talking earlier, you do have the larger magazine release. You can swap that over to other sides if you need to. Still have the same updates they did from the Gen 3. You have the loaded chamber indicator. That's really about the biggest updates they've done from that internally from the Gen 4. Gen 5 is where you'll see a lot more of the updates. Obviously the DLC finish, that nice dark black finish. They did start rounding off the frames too. That was something I forgot to mention. Most of the older generations, for the longest times, they were very squared off. They kind of round them off, sleek them up a little bit. But other than that, they still kept on to the extractor. The Gen 5 barrels. Gen 5, they kind of started to get away from the polygonal rifling. These now ship with a match grade style barrel. Still got a lot of life into it, but now you have more of your traditional rifling through it. So the biggest thing why they did that and stuff too is like the guys that used hard cast leads and lead nose in the rounds. The Glock used to warn them not to do it. Now you really don't have to worry about much of that. You can pretty much feed just about anything you want through it. A lot of the older generation Glock parts, it's something to kind of look at. They don't really interchange well from Gen 5 down, but 4 to pretty much 2, you can interchange a lot of the parts short of the recoil springs. Still kept the same captive recoil spring, get a lot of life out of these things. Like kind of we were touching on earlier, it's not unheard of Glocks with 10 to 15,000 rounds in them before you have to even update springs in them. So they're tough guns. They're simple, they're sweet, they're reliable. Kind of an idea what you would get from the traditional Glock boxes to what they pretty much are now. The old Tupperware boxes, you would literally just have the gun, spare mag, cleaning rod. These little boxes have kind of become iconic, guys that kind of like them in the collector's market. They did these boxes from Gen 1 to early Gen 3s, and then they started to change the design and the idea of the way the boxes were to the traditional, clamshelled style boxes that you see today. Your Gen 4 to Gen 5s, like I said, you typically would get extra back straps, 3 magazines, your lock, and they still do come with the cleaning rod and jig. So kind of a neat little package deal. I'm gonna do a little shooting with the Generation 2 Glock. These are a little bit harder to find. And this one's a old Washington, D.C. police trading gun, actually. So we're gonna give it a try. Like I said, Glock has been around since 1982. It's been in the US since 86. They really did revolutionize a lot of the modern striker-fired system pistols that are used on the market today. We, like I said, here at Highsmith Guns, we're big fans of the Glocks. We've done the Glock competition shoots. A lot of the guys here carry them. Just a simple, sweet gun. I mean, they're not everybody's favorite, but they work. They're kind of been called the Honda Civic of the gun world. They're ugly, but you can always depend on it. We are a Glock dealer store, so if there is a certain generation Glock you're kind of looking for, they still do Generation 3 through 5 as new production. Lipsy's, we are a Lipsy's exclusive dealer. Lipsy's has actually brought out a retro line of Gen 1s even. They call it the 17 Classic. So if you wanted to get your hands on a classic, as close as you can get to a Generation 1 without paying the money for a Generation 1 Glock, they are available. If you're curious in that, contact us at the shop and come and see us.